For 500 years, the Amazon kept a secret, not a small one. A civilization, multiple cities, roads wider than modern highways, soil engineered so precisely that MIT scientists tried to replicate it in a lab and failed. And somewhere buried in the DNA of people living in those jungles right now, a genetic signal that has absolutely no business being there. This isn't mythology. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is peer-reviewed science published in Nature and Science magazine. And somehow, almost nobody is talking about it. 7 discoveries, each one strange on its own. Together, they rewrite everything. Start with what a plane found in 2006. A small aircraft equipped with lidar, a laser mapping system, flew over the Brazilian state of Acre. The laser punched through the forest canopy, hit the ground, and bounced back with elevation data. Just routine surveying. Except the data wasn't routine. Beneath the trees, where there should have been nothing but roots and soil, there was geometry. Perfect geometry, straight lines, right angles, circles up to 300 meters across, hexagons, squares aligned to the cardinal directions with a precision that left no room for natural explanation. These weren't natural formations, they were geoglyphs, enormous shapes carved into the red clay earth. Over 450 of them discovered in Acre alone, some of them between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Here's the part that should stop you cold. They're invisible from the ground, completely. You can walk right through one and never know it's there. 2. See the full shape, you need to be several hundred feet in the air. The people who built these structures never once saw what they were making. Not the finished shape, not the full design. They spent lifetimes constructing something that only made sense from a perspective they could never reach. Think about that for a second. Why build something you'll never see? Researchers have a few theories. Ritual sites aligned to solstices. Territorial markers for a sophisticated land-owning society. But there's a third explanation that orthodox science doesn't love to discuss out loud. We'll come back to that, because what's above ground is only half the story. What's under the ground? That's where the real shock begins. January 2024, a paper drops in Science magazine. The editorial team sat on it for a long time before publishing, because what it described seemed impossible. A team of international researchers led by archaeologist Stephen Roston had lidar scanned the Upano Valley in eastern Ecuador. And what the laser found beneath that dense jungle canopy was not a village. It was not a settlement. It was a city network. At least 15 interconnected urban centers. Central plazas. Residential districts. Ceremonial platforms rising 10 meters into the air. And roads, straight, paved roads, 10 to 20 meters wide, connecting everything together across. Roughly 300 square kilometers. The civilization that built this existed from around 500 BC to 600 AD. Let that land for a moment. While Julius Caesar was crossing the Rubicon, while the Roman Pantheon was being constructed, while the ancient world we all learned about in school was at its peak, on the other side of the planet, in a jungle nobody thought could support complex society. Another civilization was paving roads and managing a metropolitan area comparable in scale to major European cities of the same era. And we had absolutely no idea. Roston, in interviews after the paper published, didn't soften it. This is the largest pre-Columbian settlement ever discovered in the Amazon. It changes everything we thought we knew about this region. His colleagues added something even more unsettling. The Upano Valley isn't an exception. It's just the first one we've studied closely. LiDAR surveys are ongoing, and every new scan adds more city outlines to the map. Cities that officially never existed. Nobody yet knows how many there are. But here's the question that discovery immediately raises. If you have a city, if you have tens of thousands of people living in one place, you need to feed them. And feeding people in the Amazon should be almost impossible. That's where the second secret comes in. Amazon soil is terrible. That sounds insane given that the Amazon contains roughly 10% of all biological life on Earth. But it's true. The nutrients in a rainforest don't live in the ground. They cycle through the living plants themselves, root to leaf and back again, almost never sinking deeper. Clear the trees, and within 2 or 3 years, you're left with a hard, dead, reddish crust that grows almost nothing. Which is exactly why modern Brazilian farmers keep clearing new jungle every few years. Old plots just stop producing, except there are patches of soil throughout the Amazon that behave completely differently. Dark, rich, deep black in color. Farmers who work these plots have known about them for generations. They call it terra preta, dark earth. On terra preta, crops yield 3 to 4 times more than surrounding soil. No fertilizer needed. And unlike normal Amazon earth, terra preta doesn't degrade. 2,000-year-old samples are still more fertile than freshly cleared land today. In 2012, a Brazilian farmer named João Carneiro showed agronomists a plot his family had worked without fertilizer for over 100 years. The soil tested at around 2,000 years old. He had no idea he was farming ancient infrastructure, because that's what terra preta is. When scientists analyzed it closely, they found it wasn't natural. It was engineered. A precise mixture of charcoal, burned bone, organic matter, and ceramic fragments, deliberately layered into the ground over centuries in consistent ratios at consistent depths. Not fertilizer, not composting. Something more sophisticated, the management of an entire soil microbiome. The charcoal creates a permanent porous structure, essentially a long-term home for the bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms that convert organic matter into plant nutrition indefinitely. So a team at MIT decided to replicate it. They had the composition, they had the approximate technique, they had equipment that the original builders could never have imagined. They ran the experiment under controlled conditions. Their result worked worse than the 2,000-year-old original. The stability, the long-term self-renewal, the microbial diversity, all of it came in below the authentic samples from the Brazilian jungle. They still don't fully know why. Either there's a step in the process that left no archaeological trace, or the soil requires centuries of living ecosystem interaction to reach full function, or both. Nobody knows. What we do know, the civilization building cities in the Upano Valley was simultaneously developing one of the most sophisticated soil technologies in human history. A technology modern science cannot completely reproduce. But cities and food are still just survival. What this civilizati on built next was something else entirely. The Bolivian plains of the Llanos de Mojos cover an area roughly the size of Germany. Every year, seasonal flooding turns the flatlands into a shallow, inland sea for months at a time. Surviving there is difficult. Building a civilization there should be flat out impossible, unless you redesign the landscape itself. Starting around 850 BC, lidar data published in 2022 by a team led by researcher Heiko Prummers revealed what's underneath the Llanos de Mojos surface, one of the largest hydraulic engineering systems ever. Built in the pre-Columbian Americas, thousands of raised platforms, artificial islands lifted above flood level, hundreds of kilometers of canals rerouting water flow, dams and weirs regulating water levels during dry season, and fish traps, sophisticated enclosures that fish would enter during floods and couldn't escape when the waters receded. This system was built and maintained for approximately 2,000 years. German hydrologist Ulrich Lombardo calculated that constructing just the raised platforms documented by lidar required moving over 6 billion cubic meters of by hand. No wheel, no metal tools, no draft animals. The Amazon had none. Just people, baskets, and generation after generation of coordinated labor. The Dutch are famous for their polders, their engineered reclaimed wetlands. They began that work in the 10th century AD. The people of the Llanos de Mojos were doing the same thing at vastly larger scale 2,000 years earlier. And then, around 1400 AD, it stopped. The canals went unmaintained. The platforms began to sink. The system that had sustained hundreds of thousands of people across centuries collapsed within a few decades into the flooded, untouched plain that explorers and historians would later describe as pristine wilderness. Why? Hold that question. Because the answer connects to everything else. And we're not ready for it yet. In 1925, a British lieutenant colonel named Percy Harrison Fawcett walked into the Amazon and never came back. He wasn't a dreamer. He was a career military officer, a trained surveyor who had worked for the Royal Geographical Society, and a man who had already completed 7 successful expeditions into the Amazon and returned from every one. He knew those jungles better than most people alive. He had a source. A handwritten Portuguese document from 1753 known as Manuscript 512. A field report from an unknown explorer describing the ruins of a massive stone city deep in the Brazilian interior. Paved streets, monumental arches, inscriptions in a language that matched nothing on record. Fawcett called it the City of Z, and he was certain it was real. In 1925, he went to find it. His son and a close friend went with him. None of them came out. Over the next several decades, more than 100 search expeditions entered the Amazon, looking for Fawcett or for what he was looking for. 13 of them lost people. In 2005, American journalist David Grann followed Fawcett's route and wrote the book The Lost City of Z. While researching it, he met Brazilian anthropologist Michael Heckenberger, who had spent years working with the Kikuro people in the Xingu Basin. Heckenberger had already mapped something he called Kuhiku, a network of approximately 20 settlements connected by roads, surrounded by earthworks, divided by deliberately dug canals. Total area, roughly 1,000 square kilometers. Estimated. Population at its height, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people. When Grann described Fawcett's obsession, Heckenberger looked at his own map and said quietly, "This is his city of Z." The man everyone called a fantasist was walking toward a real place. He just didn't have the right tools. Fawcett died looking for a city that was actually there. But Kuhiku shares something. With everything else we've covered, it was abandoned, not conquered, not burned, not destroyed by war, just emptied. The evidence of habitation cuts off sharply in roughly the same broad time frame as the collapse in the Llanos de Mojos. Two different locations, two different cultures, one pattern. That pattern has a darker dimension, and it lives inside the DNA of the people still in those jungles today. In 2015, an international team led by geneticist Pontus Skoglund published a landmark study in Nature. They had analyzed the genomes of over 200 indigenous groups across both American continents, comparing them to populations from Asia, Australia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. They found something that broke their models. Several Amazonian groups, the Surue, the Kurushiana, and others, carried a specific genetic signal. Not the signal tracing back to Siberian ancestors who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which accounts for the ancestry of most indigenous Americans. Something different. Something that most closely resembled the genetic profile of Aboriginal Australians and the people of Papua New Guinea. 9,000 kilometers of open Pacific Ocean separates those populations from the Amazon. The scientists named this mystery lineage population Y after Ipaquera, which means ancestor in the Tupi language, and they've spent the years since trying to explain how it got there. The conservative interpretation: population Y is a remnant of an ancient Siberian population that existed before the ancestors of Australians and Americans diverged roughly 50,000 years ago and somehow reached South America by a separate route, possibly along the Pacific coast. The more radical interpretation: some group crossed the open Pacific directly, which requires navigational capability that mainstream archaeology still doesn't want to assign to populations of that era. What isn't disputed, this signal exists specifically in Amazonian peoples, not in the Aztec, not in the Maya, not in the Inca, in the people whose ancestors lived for millennia in the deep jungle, the same people whose cities we are only now beginning to find beneath the canopy. And the oral traditions of several of these groups describe something remarkable. They speak of a previous people, a people who were different, who knew things the current generations do not, who built things that cannot be built now, and who vanished or were made to vanish long before living memory. What happened to them? Look at the timeline, between roughly 600 AD and 1400 AD. Different places, different years, but the same broad window. Something sweeps through the Amazon basin. The great cities stop expanding. The terra preta stops accumulating. The canals of the Llanos de Mojos go unmaintained. The complexes like Kuhiku empty out. There are almost no signs of war, no burned fortifications, no mass graves, no conquest layer. These places weren't destroyed. They were left. Researchers have a leading theory that academic institutions still struggle to say clearly, because it means the catastrophe began before anyone recorded it. European disease may have reached the Amazon before Europeans did, not in 1492 with Columbus, possibly decades earlier. possibly a century earlier, through coastal contacts, through trade networks extending inland, through intermediate populations passing illness from community to community without a single European ever setting foot in the jungle. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases that indigenous Americans had no immune history with. They could have traveled inward for generations before the first European explorer arrived to write anything down. If the Amazon's pre-contact population numbered in the millions and lidar data increasingly suggests it did, then a wave of invisible epidemics explains perfectly why cities empty without violence. People don't flee an army. They scatter from a sickness nobody can see or fight. But there's a second possibility, one that works in parallel. Between the 9th and 12th centuries, climate records from across tropical America show signs of serious drought. The hydraulic systems of the Llanos de Mojos were built for predictable seasonal flooding. When the floods became irregular, too weak, too late, too unpredictable, the entire agricultural logic of the civilization collapsed. Lose one harvest and you adapt. Lose 3 in a row and a society built on precise water management doesn't recover. It dissolves. And then there's something scientists discuss more carefully. The oral traditions of multiple Amazonian peoples describe a fire from the sky. A strike from above that destroyed a great civilization of builders. These accounts are unverified. They're not dated. But geologists working in central Brazil have found in peat bog deposits thin layers with abnormal iridium concentrations and microscopic glass spherules, signatures of an intense heat event. The dating of those layers falls inside the same broad collapse window. Is it connected? There is no official position yet. Here is what we know for certain. Bene. ADH the Amazon canopy, cities. Beneath those cities, engineered soil that modern science cannot replicate. Beneath that soil, thousands of years of history we are only beginning to read. And inside, the living descendants of the people who built all of it, a genetic thread connecting them to the other side of the earth, carried by ancestors whose names we don't know, whose routes we don't understand, and whose disappearance we are only now beginning to recognize as the enormous, quiet catastrophe it was. The Amazon was never untouched wilderness. It is ruins, the largest, most silent, most unstudied ruins on Earth. We flew over them in planes. We walked through them in boots. We cleared them for cattle pasture. And the whole time, we had no idea what was underneath our feet. Every new lidar scan adds more to the map. More city outlines, more roads, more plazas. And every addition makes everything we thought we knew feel a little smaller. Right now, while you're watching this, there are lidar systems running over sections of the Amazon. Data is being processed. Papers are being written. And somewhere on a hard drive in a university lab, there is almost certainly a map of a city the world doesn't know about yet. A city that's been waiting 2,000 years. It can wait a few more months.